themselves. And that's partly why people love to be attended to, you know? Like, if I meet people on the street, you know, I ask them their name. They're all usually flustered when they come up to me. They don't really want to interrupt me, and then they're flustered. And the first thing I do is shake their hand and ask them their name. And I listen, you know? Not that good at remembering names, but I listen to it. And they know how to say their name, and so it kind of settles them down, and then it sort of marks them out as a person against the background, eh? And then if I pay attention to them and listen, they will tell me something in like 10 seconds.
Unbelievable that
I need
nobody
to
looks
know.
at this, you know? This
'Cause
fucking video,
they have something to say,
I think this
you know?
video has one view
And then if you
on it.
listen, people tell you what they
On
have
the
to
Miguel
say, and then you
Everyone
get
channel,
wise
you know?
because you collect all that.
Fucking unbelievable.
And
It
so
was
you want
supposed
to
to
help
be,
someone. Well, first of all, you would
it was
decide.
supposed to be for the Candace Owens series. And I'm now taking all these videos and adding them to the Jordan Peterson series. But so that's the only reason I'm over here, is just to remaster these videos. But they're unbelievable, man. It's unfucking believable. Even if I didn't add the red filter, I can still clearly see all the imagery everywhere. So, you know, as usual, I ask, where the fuck is everybody, man? Digital collection of electromagnetic nanocarbon from the cloud level. Feline, canine, rodent, ape, human, and beast. Looking at the true creator's work. Blah, blah, blah. See the builders, triangular builders, everywhere you look. Blah, blah, blah. Fucking ridiculous, man. Years clicking by. Family, friends, YouTube, Facebook. Nope, ain't gonna fucking happen. Nobody's gonna go look. Let's see here. Okay, I did rule 2. Oh, this is one of my favorite interviews of him, actually. Jordan Peterson, I like this interview with your dad. I gotta wait for the commercial to end now.
I never do that. You see, I hardly ever skipped school. And every time I did, God damn it, you caught me. I did it like 3 times. One time I drove to Hines Creek.
3 times.
Really? It wasn't very, I tell you, it wasn't very often. One time I drove to Hines Creek to get away from you. I thought, I'll drive to Hines Creek. He's not going to find me there. And then on the way back from Hines Creek, you drove by and waved at me. I said, oh my God, he caught me again. So ridiculous. Hello, everybody. I decided today that I'm going to talk to my dad as the subject for my YouTube video and podcast and find out more about his life, his young life on the prairie in Saskatchewan, about his father, my grandfather, his grandfather, my great-grandfather, his mother, and what it was like growing up back in the 40s mostly. He was born in 1937, July of 1937. And we've talked about such things, but not that much. And so there's lots of things I want to know. And so that's what we're going to try to talk about today. And I'm going to walk through his life with him and ask him a bunch of questions so that I have the answers to the questions. And I hope you enjoy it. Hello.
Hey, George.
How are you doing?
Just as good as it gets.
Good. Glad to hear it. So I thought I'd start by telling the story of this 3rd floor that I built on my house. And so one of the things we did, we were going to build a log cabin on the 3rd floor of this semi-detached house right in downtown Toronto. Tammy and I thought about that. I guess we wanted a cabin out in the woods, but we thought we could at least build one on our 3rd floor. And that sort of morphed into this Native American big house, which is all made of wood inside, unlike the plaster sheeting that makes up the rest of the house. So walking up there is quite a transition. And we built it with some local architects and with some input from Kwakayo Carver, who filled it up with totem poles. But on the walls, you and I talked about the possibility of tearing some old wood off the farmstead in Saskatchewan, off the original buildings there that great-grandpa Barrett homesteaded. And so that happened when the totem poles came across the country on a 53-foot truck. Joel, my brother, had helped tear a bunch of the wood off the buildings surrounding the original house and off the barn. And so the wall, both walls, are done in gray wood or red wood, because some of the buildings were red, that barn red, or they're made of doors from the buildings. So, and you had stripped some of that wood off years ago to use in your room downstairs as well. That was before that anything like that was popular.
Yeah, I took the floor out of the loft of the barn and I used it for flooring in the cabins at the lake.
I didn't know you used it for flooring there. You also used it in a decorative way in the pool room. That's pool table, by the way, not pool.
Downstairs here, you mean?
Yeah.
No, that wasn't from the barn. That was from a friend of mine.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, I think I got the idea for using the old wood. Anyways, we did get the stuff stripped away from the old farmstead. So now my great-grandfather, your grandfather, Barrett, from whom my middle name is derived, he came to North America from Norway.
No, he was born in North Dakota or in Minnesota.
Was it his father that came?
Yeah, his father and his father-in-law.
Did you tell me they built a boat and came to Norway, or came from Norway to New York?
That actually was his father-in-law that built the boat. And the two families came. I think there were a total of 9 or 10 on the boat. Yeah, they left Norway and sailed all the way to New York.
And then they ended up in the Midwest, where there were a lot of Norwegian settlers.
Well, yeah, Minnesota and North Dakota were the, Wisconsin too, to a certain extent. They were just the areas where the Norwegians and the Swedes settled, yeah. So
And then
they migrated that way.
And then there was a move up into Saskatchewan.
Yeah, about 1910, I think, was the first time that they came up and homesteaded. And then they left again because it didn't work out as, I guess, homestead life was pretty tough, so they left again, but they didn't sell the place. They did have an auction. My grandfather's old clock was in the auction. And when they came back to Saskatchewan, they went to an auction sale and he bought it back. And I still have it.
So how did they get up to Saskatchewan from Minnesota at that time? Was it rail?
No, they drove up. In fact, I think you have a picture of the old car that they drove up in. I don't know what it was. I can remember seeing pictures of it.
They left, and I presume they went back down to Minnesota, but then they came back.
No,
or where'd they go?
North Dakota, place called Vang, V-A-N-G. Both families were in that area, not separated by too much. I think my grandfather worked in the dairy there.
And by both families, who do you mean?
Well, I mean my grandmother's family and my grandfather's family.
And they were married when they came up to Saskatchewan already.
Yeah, yeah.
And so why did they decide to come to Saskatchewan if they were already settled in North Dakota?
Well, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence.
Yeah, except when it's
And,
in
you know,
northern Saskatchewan. Burr.
Free land, and it's not colder in Saskatchewan than it is in North Dakota.
Right. And so the Canadian government was offering homesteaders at that time a chunk of land if they would come in and do what to it?
Well, they had to prove it up over a period of 3 years. I've forgotten how, I think they had to break about 10 acres the first year. And I think they were required to have some sort of domicile on it. And that's probably a loose word for home.
Right. Right. And so do you have any idea why they left the first time? You said it was hard. I mean, we can talk about that in a minute, but any specific
I really
reason?
don't have. No, I don't really have. I imagine there were a number of factors. I'm sure life was fairly tough in Saskatchewan. I imagine they were homesick. Anyway, that's the story. They left.
And do you know how long it was before they came back?
I think it was about a matter of about a year and a half, something like that, or maybe just a year. But I'm not sure of that, George.
They thought they'd give it another try, and the second time they stayed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe it wasn't as bad as they thought, you know.
So what would it have meant to break 10 acres of land at that time? What would have you had to do and how?
Well, you took your axe and you cut down the poplar that was on the place, and I guess there were a few spruce on it as well. And then you took your grub hoe out and tried to dig the roots out. And you used your team to pull the roots out and piled them up and burned them and cultivated the land as best you could and probably sowed some wheat on it.
So that whole area, so that was near Nacum, Saskatchewan. If anyone wants
Yeah.
to look on a map, that whole area, the prairie there, would have been covered with trees.
Yeah, there were trees there at that time. Yeah, it was covered with trees.
So to clear 10 acres meant you had to cut down hundreds of trees, I presume, and then you had to pull the roots out of the ground one at a time with a team of horses. That's why you could only clear 10 acres, or why you had to clear 10 acres, you said, in the first year. Because 10 acres isn't that big by farm standards.
I think it was 10 acres a year for 3 years to claim it up. I don't know. These are things we never really talked about when I was a kid.
How do you know about it at all?
Well, I guess sitting around the table listening to the adults talk, I picked up a lot of it.
So how many kids did your grandparents have?
They just had the one, Stanley.
Stanley.
My dad.
And Stanley was adopted.
He was.
And was he adopted in the United States or was he adopted in Saskatchewan?
He was adopted in Saskatchewan.
Do you know if they knew did they know anything about him? Did they know anything about his family?
That I have no idea about. That was something that was never talked about as far as I can remember.
Do you know how old he was?
I don't think he was an infant. He was an infant. I don't think I knew Dad was adopted until I was a teenager. And then I probably didn't believe it the first time I was told.
Was it a shock?
I don't know whether you'd call it a shock or not. It was, I suppose it was a bit of a shock, yeah.
So, and they had no other children.
They had no other children.
And so I remember going out to that farmstead, and that would have been 25 years probably after you had left it, with great grandpa Barrett. You, a couple of times, to ride on a potato harvester he had built, and all the outbuildings were still out there, including the blacksmith shop and the I don't remember what you called it. It was this contraption like an enclosed sled that you used to go to school in. It was still
caboose?
intact. Caboose, yeah, you called it a caboose. Why was it called a caboose?
Oh, God only knows. I don't know. I have no idea why it was called a caboose. That's probably a good question to ask Google.
All right, so you, Barrett and his wife, and I don't remember Barrett's wife's name. Of course, I never knew her. Clara. So they built a log house on the prairie and a barn, and there must have been 8 or 9 other buildings, small shed-like buildings. One of them was a blacksmith shop.
Oh, yeah. Well, there were different buildings over different periods of time. But you're right, there were probably at least a half dozen other buildings than the house and the barn and the shop.
And the pump, which was surrounded by a big tractor, big metal tractor wheel.
Yes, it was a wheel off a steamer that we made a trough out of.
And the cabin you grew up in, which was a log cabin, it was insulated with cardboard, if I remember correctly. But when I knew the house, it was still standing, right? We could still go in it. It was still standing.
Well, I think it's still kind of standing. Maybe not. I don't know. I haven't been there for a couple of years now.
Yeah, the last time I saw it was a few years ago, and it had collapsed a fair bit. I don't think you could get inside it anymore. But it had a central room and a bedroom on. Did it face? Which direction did it face?
It had 2 bedrooms on the east side.
Okay, so it was one room, one main room with 2 bedrooms on the east side? Or was there a bedroom on the other side too?
No, there was a kitchen and a hallway and a living room is what we called it. And then there were the 2 bedrooms on the east side. The house, I guess, was long, it was long north and south.
Right.
And it wasn't very big.
No, how many square feet do you think it was? Like 600?
Yeah, probably about that.
Yeah, like 1 floor of my semi-detached. In Toronto.
Probably.
Yeah. And you had 2 sisters grow up with you there. How many people lived in that house when you were a little kid?
Well, how old was I?
Well, how old were you?
Kid.
How old were you when you left that house and moved into town?
I was probably about 9 or 10.
Okay, so you should have some pretty decent memories of that place if you were that old. Okay, so how many people lived there in that house from the time you were born till the time you were 10, generally speaking?
Well, I guess there'd have been 4 adults and 3 kids.
4 adults. So your grandfather and your grandmother, Barrett and Clara, and Stanley, your dad, and
my
Bernice,
mother, Bernice.
Bernice, his wife, and your sister Judy and your sister Betty, both of whom were younger than you.
Right.
Okay, how did all 7 of you live in that house? There was 2 bedrooms. How was that? How did you manage that?
How did we manage that? I really have no idea how we managed.
Well, who slept in which bedrooms? Were all the kids in one bedroom? But that would only leave one room for the adults.
Yeah. I don't know whether I can answer that question or not. I don't think I know.
Okay. Okay. You have a soft spot in your heart for that house.
A soft spot.
Yeah, well, you always go back and visit it, and you're nostalgic when you go out to the farm.
Yeah, I guess I have a soft spot for it. I grew up there.
Yeah, well, what was it like to grow up there?
Good.
Good how? What did you do? Like when you were a little kid, when you were just the earliest memories you have. What are the earliest memories you have of being out there? Now, you spoke Norwegian out there, right? Primarily.
Well, yeah, kind of a Minnesota Norwegian, I guess. My grandfather and grandmother spoke Norwegian mainly. They could both speak English, but mainly they spoke Norwegian. My dad spoke Norwegian when he was with my grandfather and grandmother, and English the rest of the time. My mother, Bernice, probably could speak some Norwegian, but we spoke some English too because neighbors weren't always fluent in Norwegian, although a lot of them were.
So, what was life like there on the farmstead when you were a kid? You had animals, you had horses.
We had horses and cattle, pigs, chickens.
Who took care of them?
Well, I guess we all did, or I shouldn't say we all did, but my grandfather and grandmother and mom and dad took care of them.
And what did that entail? And how many cows were there? Do you have any idea?
Well, I would guess that there were probably about 6 cows that were milk producers, and then the rest were raised for beef. Excuse me. Horses, we probably had 4 or 5 horses all the time.
And did you ride a lot?
Ride horse?
Yeah.
No, not very much. I rode some, but I wouldn't say I was a cowboy or anything.
Any particular reason? Did you like horses? Was it interesting to you, or were they work animals?
Well, both. They were interesting. They were work animals. I mean, that's what pulled the implements when I was a kid. I can remember when we got our first tractor. And I can remember when we got our first rubber-tired tractor. But I can also remember riding on implements with my grandfather, driving 4 horses in front of it.
Plowing and that sort of thing, and harvesting.
Well, I don't remember plowing as such, but I remember seeding. Because on the seeder you could stand on a platform at the back of the unit, and you had a good view of everything, and there was something to hang on to so you didn't fall off. And we had an old dog named Pooch who used to sit right up on the seed box and kind of look around the whole country while we were doing that. He got pretty good at balancing.
How big a farm would have the family handled at that time?
I think it was 3/4 as long as I can remember.
And how many acres are in a quarter?
180, 160.
160. So it was 480 acres. And so the farm obviously expanded past the initial homestead relatively rapidly?
That I don't know. I know who owned the quarters that were bought and brought into the farm, but I don't know the details of it, and I don't know when.
Right, so when Barrett and Clara came back up, they made enough of a go at it the second time to establish a farmstead that was successful enough to buy other reasonably sizable pieces of land. I mean, 3/4 is not an immense farm by modern standards, obviously, but it's not no land at all. It's
No, it was probably at its time fairly average. I mean, there were families that had 1/4 of land. So 3/4 was actually pretty good.
and so everything you ate, I presume, pretty much came directly off the farm with the animals that you had. So eggs and milk. Were you milking cows every day?
I wasn't. My mother was a great milker. I can remember her doing the milking a good portion of the time.
Grandma showed me one day a picture of the cabin with the firewood she had split for the winter. And if that cabin was 600 square feet and a story high, the pile of wood that she split looked to be 1,200 square feet and about at least as tall as the cabin.
When she said she split it, I don't think she meant that she manually split it. She may have had something to do with it, but we had a wood splitter, which was run by a small gas engine, and you could split wood to beat the devil with it.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a lot easier than having to do it with an axe. I know that Grandma was a busy woman, but that does
she
make
was.
Yeah, well, she must have had her hands full with three kids and a whole farm to run. And then when the threshing crews came in the fall, if I also recall, she used to have to feed them as well, and that was on a wood stove.
She and my grandma, yeah. And that
Yeah.
would be 14, 15 men. It pretty well filled the kitchen as I remember it.
Yeah, I bet. So, and they were fed how many times a day? Would she feed them 3 times a day when they were threshing?
3 times a day.
Right, so that's 52 meals for very hungry men. And that would be one of her many chores.
Yeah. Nobody said it was easy.
No, and Grandpa showed me one time or I saw a picture of him. I think he showed me, though, the parka that he wore out in the winter to do his farm work. And I mean, Saskatchewan's plenty cold. It gets to be minus 40 there on no shortage of occasions, and it also has quite the blistering wind. And I mean, it was a wool jacket and jeans essentially underneath it. It wasn't anything particularly bulky or fancy. So I imagine winter was could be pretty brutal.
Well, I think it was generally true that there weren't adequate clothes for the temperatures that we did have. I mean, the best you had was wool, and wool was the main thing. Wool pants, wool underwear, a heavy wool coat if you were lucky enough to have one. Maybe it had canvas on the outside for a windbreak. But those guys were tough,
Yeah, well, I remember Grandpa's forearms. I mean, they were no joke when he was I remember him from about the time I was 10, I suppose. I think that's about where his memories come from. He would have been 50 probably at that point. And I mean, he had immense forearms. he's a very strongly built person, and he had done plenty of work. So, did you have a happy childhood, would you say?
Did I have a happy childhood?
Yeah, well, like I said, you're attached to the farm.
I would say yes, I had a happy childhood.
Okay, and up to what age?
Well, I suppose teen years.
So what made it a happy childhood?
Well, what wouldn't have made it a happy childhood?
Well,
I mean, you
people
were
have
free as a breeze. You had acres and acres to wander around in. There was lots of wildlife. There were some chores. It was just a good life.
what chores did you have to do?
Oh, you had to bring in wood. Occasionally you had to bring in a pail of water. Usually it was only about a half a pail because you couldn't carry a whole pail. You had to go to the pump and pump the water into the pail, and then it wasn't very far to carry it, but it had to be carried occasionally.
So you weren't overwhelmed with chores, by the sounds of it.
No, I wouldn't say I was overwhelmed with it at all. No,
So you had
I
a lot
had
of
some things to do.
right, and you did them.
Yeah.
And if you didn't do them, what happened? Or did that just not happen?
Oh, I imagine it happened. I would imagine the scolding was probably the main thing.
Who from?
Well, the scolding would probably have come from my mother or my grandmother. Dad
you
was
had-
pretty strict. He didn't scold much.
So in what way was he strict?
Well, let's just say he was strict.
Well, I'm curious about I'm curious about your relationship with your great grandfather and your father, because you've intimated that in many ways you were raised by your great grandfather. And I remember when I was about, I think great grandfather Barron died when I was about 9, 10.
9 or 10, yeah.
Yeah, that was the first brush I really had with loss. And I wasn't so upset with his loss because I didn't know him that well. I mean, I was sad about it because I liked him, but you were really broken up by that. And so that was the first time I think I ever remember seeing you like emotionally distressed. And it lasted at least a week, which isn't a tremendous amount of time, but it was a tremendous amount of time as far as I was concerned.
Yeah,
So-
well, he was pretty important.
Yeah, so why was he so important to you? What was it about him and your relationship with him?
I think kids have a real relationship with their grandparents if they are fortunate enough to have them around. And, I can remember walking 3 steps behind him all over the farm,
So you trailed around behind him.
day in and day out.
Uh-huh. And that was fine with him.
Yeah,
Or
I
was it
think
more?
it was fine with him.
Was it
He
more
never
than
told
fine?
me to go home and
Oh, yeah. Okay, well, that's something. I mean, I remember the day, for example, we went out and rode on this. Now, he was quite a handy person and quite a creative person, mechanically. I mean,
Yeah, he was.
this potato harvester he built it. Well, you could drive it, and I don't really remember how it harvested potatoes, but he had built it pretty much from the ground up, if I remember correctly.
Well, it didn't really harvest potatoes. It was built so that you could drive it in a potato patch without driving over the rows. It had quite a bit of clearance and outrigger wheels on it.
Right, right.
And mainly it pulled implements that harvested potatoes.
I see, I see. So it was a custom built tractor in some sense.
It was a custom built tractor, right?
Right, and he did work in the blacksmith shop.
Oh, he was a good he was a good blacksmith, yeah. And it was probably one of his, I guess you'd call it a vocation. Because if it was raining or if it was miserable, it was pretty easy to find Grandpa and me in the shop. Because there was usually a fire on in there, and the building wasn't very large, so it was warm, and there was always lots to do.
What did you do?
Especially for him.
Yeah. What did you do in the blacksmith shop?
Oh, hell, I can't remember now. There was always stuff to do in there. There was lots of junk pieces lying around, and we had a I don't know what you'd call it. It was a wheel mounted on what was like a stationary bicycle. And you used to be able to get onto it and pedal so that the wheel went around, and then you could sharpen your sickle or your axe or your knife or a stick or whatever you had. And you could spend a lot of time at that when you were 7 and 8 years old.
And what sort of tools did he make in the blacksmith shop?
What sort of tools? Well, I can remember him building a grain elevator. We'd call it like an auger for grain, and I think, as I remember it, he built almost all of it out of pieces. He bent the tin or the galvanized metal that built the chute, and wasn't awfully big. It probably only lifted the grain maybe 12 feet, something like that. But it worked sort of like, it didn't work like an auger. It had a belt in it so that it just picked up the grain and moved it along on a belt that had, I don't know what you'd call them even, paddles of a type on them. Yeah. He was always building something.
So was it from him that you learned how to use tools and to appreciate tools? Because you like to build things. I mean, you've gunsmithed.
Oh, I think it probably was to a large extent due to him.
Did he teach you explicitly?
I'm sure he kept.
Or
Pardon?
did he teach you explicitly, or did you pick up most of it by watching?
Oh, well, both. I'm sure that he probably made sure that I was kept busy and out of trouble while I was in the shop. And, that probably involved straightening nails and God knows what else.
Right, so you had small productive jobs to do while you were hanging about with him.
Well, they were, a job is what the body is obliged to do. Yeah. And,
so this wasn't a job.
If it's not obliged to do it, then it's fun or play.
And so that's kind of how you remember that, as play.
Well, I remember it as a good time, yeah.
Right. So he was easy to get along with for you? He was good to you?
Yeah, very good to me.
How about your grandma?
Grandma was great, yeah.
How? What was great about her?
Well, she was extraordinarily kind. I can't ever remember her disciplining me other than maybe shaking her head or something. She taught me how to read at an early age. We used to do homework together. There were always treats. Who knows? She was very kind.
She taught you to read, so that was how you learned to read.
Yeah. I don't really remember learning to read. I mean, I always had people reading to me. My grandfather read to me a lot. So did Mom. So did my grandmother. I can remember reading the comics. That was very important. You know, the Cats and Jammer Kids and Little Abner and that kind of thing. You know, for a long time I didn't read it. They read it. But after a while, well, I don't know. You kind of pick it up.
So
I can remember. Go ahead.
Did people in your house read a lot when they had some leisure time?
I wouldn't say a lot because there wasn't all that much leisure time. And, you know, for many years, when it got dark, it was dark inside the house too. Kerosene lamps didn't throw very much light.
Right. Was there ever electricity in the cabin that you grew up in up till the time you left?
No.
So that was all kerosene.
Kerosene and later gas lamps.
Right, which were a little brighter.
Yeah, they were considerably brighter.
Right. And
no,
so,
it never had power.
Right, so people were up at dawn, I presume, and then, well, in bed, well, when it was dark, and in the winter, that would be pretty early.
Yeah.
So you had a lot of time to spend by yourself if you wanted to wander around out onto the fields and into the nearby woods and lake nearby?
No, sloughs, which aren't as deep as lakes, I guess, similar, but there were lots of sloughs around, and sloughs always had wildlife around them. Yeah, I wandered around a lot when I was a kid. I think I knew every bush within about 5 miles of home pretty intimately.
And do you mean every tree?
Well, not every tree, but I wasn't about to get lost in it.
Yeah, well, there's something about that exploration you do when you're a kid that really familiarizes yourself deeply with a place. I don't know if you ever do that again in your life when you move. You know, like I can remember the houses around the house I grew up in Fairview far better in my imagination than I can picture the houses in this neighborhood. Like far better. Even though I only lived there for 8 years and I've lived here for almost 20, I still have a much better map, house by house, in my head of the immediate neighborhood. I think when you're a kid, you pay attention to things in a different way than you do when you're an adult because everything's so new.
Yeah. And, well, I believe you're right. I think kids pay attention to what's going on.
Yeah, well, I think well, you kind of, your perceptions get kind of generic, you know, after you've seen 300 houses, you sort of know what a house is and you don't have to look at it anymore. You just sort of replace it in your imagination with an image of a house, you know, and that works as a placeholder, but you don't know the back alley in detail like you did when you were a kid. And, you know, I think you really lose a sense of familiarity because of that. That deep sense of belonging to a place is associated with that really detailed exploration. Like I've noticed in the houses I've moved into and apartments that unless any corner that I haven't cleaned, any drawer that I haven't organized is kind of foreign territory in some sense. It's not friendly to me. But if I get in there into the details and explore completely the house, which I'm trying to do with this house, we renovated it 3 years ago, but I was so sick I couldn't remap it, and it seems really foreign to me. And I'm not happy in the house because I don't really understand the house. It's alien to me. And so yesterday I spent 8 hours cleaning out a closet that was full of stuff I hadn't been able to touch for 3 years, and that was a great relief. Now I kind of like my closet now. I know exactly what's in it. I know exactly where everything is. I put it there. Like, I sort of touched everything. It's mine now. Whereas before it was just this place that was full of stuff I didn't understand and a bunch of work that I hadn't done, and was leery of it. There's still a lot of the houses like that, so I'm still not comfortable here. But I will be. Before I leave in January. We're going to go through every square inch of it and hopefully put it in order. It makes you much calmer to know the
Where are you
place you're at in
going in
detail.
January?
I'm going on tour.
Oh, okay.
Going to Washington first for a week or 10 days.
Right. I understand now.
Hey, and I talked to Joe Rogan the other day.
Yeah?
Yeah, so I'm booked on his show in Austin on the 24th.
24th of?
24th of January, just before the tour starts. It starts
Oh, yeah, good.
on the 25th. Yeah, it was really good to talk to him.
I always
So-
enjoyed listening to those.
Yeah, well, Rogan, he's quite the guy. He's
Yeah.
done a lot of things